tremendous thanksgiving. Brother Ken Wubbles will be again exhorting us this morning and continuing with his topic of parables through the eyes of the Messiah. If you would turn with me to Luke chapter 7. Luke 7, verse 36. Through 50. And one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he said, Master, say on. There was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one owed 500 pence, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered into your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman, since I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil you did not anoint, but this woman has anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore say I unto you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. And he said unto her, Your sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, Who is this that forgives sins also? And he said to the woman, Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Let's give our attention to Brother Ken.
We talked a little bit during the Sunday school hour about the purpose of parables. They're not just stories meant to illustrate a point. They are pointed replies to specific questions of individuals who came to Jesus, and he provided them what they needed, and he challenged them to respond. He provided them a place to come and sit, a house in which to live, and to look at the world differently than when they had originally posed the question to him. What does it mean to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself? To the lawyer who put that question to him, it meant you must live your life with compassion. And that was a challenge. And in this parable, in Luke chapter 7, we see another one, but with a quite different attitude than the lawyer had. You know, it's interesting to look at how the Gospels were put together, how they were compiled. And Luke's Gospel in particular is kind of fascinating. You know, the suggestion when you read the first few verses in Luke chapter 1 about the sense that the research that Luke did, the diligent questioning, the gathering together of material, suggests that what we sometimes perceive as being random events coupled together were not random events coupled together at all, but very carefully thought out scenarios which linked to each other. And it's very instructive to go back and think about that structure that there is to this book, because there are more parables in the Gospel of Luke than there are in Matthew or Mark. And one can envision how Luke would have compiled these parables. In the book of Acts, you get a sense of Luke's travels. There's those we passages that pick up at a certain time as Paul, after his third missionary journey, is coming back, where suddenly the pronouns in the narrative in the book of Acts change from they to we, and from them to us, indicating that Luke is now in the company of Paul. And you see how those passages suddenly change after Paul is imprisoned, and then pick up again 2 years later when Paul is sent to Rome. And it would seem like that 2-year period where Paul was in prison, that Luke spent his time traveling around the area of Judea and Galilee, visiting the different ecclesias, the different groups, and listening to them and the stories, the first-hand stories they would be telling about the Master. These were things, the parables, that people remembered, and they recounted to each other to illustrate issues that were of practical importance to them in the first century church in Palestine, in Judea, in Samaria, and in Galilee. And that's what Luke compiled during that 2-year period. And so when we pick up Luke's gospel, I would encourage you not to look at it as a series of unrelated discussions, unrelated incidents, but a highly structured, carefully thought out presentation of material that was in practical, everyday use when the believers met together in the first century. And chapter 7 of Luke is an example of one of these. Because the chapter is all about the question, is Jesus the Christ? Is he the Messiah? Tell me, why are you sitting here today? What brings you here? I heard the Master say. I remember seeing him one time, and that's what convinced me. That's what made me understand who he was, and that's why I'm sitting here in this bench, in this building today. Luke chapter 7, amongst these people who would share these stories were a centurion who had a servant who was ill and who sent for Jesus because he understood the authority and the power that Jesus had. It included people who saw a young man raised from the dead, Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. And having seen this, said, Emmanuel, God has visited his people. Luke 7, verse 16. It included people like John the Baptist, who now is in prison and sends his disciples and asks the question, are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another? Verse 20. And the things that they saw as in response to that question. And it included some who did not respond, who had ears but did not hear, who had eyes and did not see. Verse 30 of chapter 7. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves not having been baptized by him. Their response, verse 31, Jesus said, what are we to make of this? Some people respond one way, some people another. The reason he spoke in parables, to bring this out of people, so that seeing you might see and hearing you might hear. Not all responded. The intent of verses 31 through 35 is that you aren't what we expected. You're not doing what we thought you should be doing. We piped to you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not weep. You're just not what we expected. I can see what you're doing. I can hear what you're saying, but it's not what I expected. Eyes to see, ears to hear. John the Baptist came fasting. Jesus came eating and drinking. A friend of tax collectors and sinners. Verse 35, yet wisdom is justified by all her children. It will play out in the end. The wisdom of all this you will eventually see. It may not fit your expectations right now, but it will all play out, and you will see. And it's in that context that we come to the story that I want to talk about of a Pharisee who asked him to eat with him. Now I say this is a different kind of confrontation than the one we talked about during the Sunday school period with the lawyer. There's a certain etiquette that we're all aware of. This is culture. This is custom. When you go to visit someone in their house, what do you expect? Well, you expect someone to greet you, to perhaps shake your hand, give you a hug, to welcome you into the house, to offer you something to eat, to offer you something to drink. This invitation that was offered to Jesus is in the context of, who are you? And take a look at verses 36. It says, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat at table. This whole event is going to turn around the lack of courtesy that there was given to Jesus as he entered his house. As we've already read it, you know the story. It turns around the fact that Simon did not pay the least amount of respect to Jesus. He invites him to dinner, but does he greet him at the door? No. Does he offer him refreshment? Well, you might say he invited him to eat. But as you're going to see, he did not perform the least of the most common courtesies that were done in that culture at that time, which is when you invite someone to eat in your house, you offer to wash their feet. You greet them, perhaps with a kiss. And it's curious in this particular case because he addresses Jesus in verse 40 as teacher. Why wouldn't he pay Jesus the minimal respect when he addresses him as teacher? It's because in the back of his mind, the question is coming up. The question is expressed in verse 39. If this man were a prophet, he would have known who it was and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. So the motivation here of Simon is not one of wanting to understand or wanting to see. It's examining the same question that this whole chapter is talking about. Is this indeed a prophet? And he has his doubts. The reason he has his doubts is because there's a backstory to this chapter. And you have to read it in its entirety to see the backstory. The backstory deals with a certain woman who was in the city. And before this story even starts, you have to understand that Jesus had talked to this woman. And she was recognized as a member, as an outcast of the community. She was a prostitute. And as such, she was someone who a Pharisee like Simon would have no social dealings with. But he would know specifically and precisely who she was. She would be notorious in that town. And Jesus had had an encounter with her earlier in that day and had forgiven her sins. And Simon witnessed that. And so he calls to the master and says, "Come and dine with me." We know that a prophet would not do this. Don't you know what kind of woman this is? And the answer is yes. Jesus knew precisely who she was. And she had responded to the overture of Jesus earlier in the day, to her forgiveness of her sins. And she was overwhelmed. You know, we don't know precisely what he said to her, but we do know the reaction. That when Jesus was invited into the house of Simon the Pharisee, she learned about it, and she followed him to that house. Now again, we have to understand the setting. It seems a bit strange for us how she could get into the house. And I know there's many answers out there. People want to see connections, some of which are fairly dubious and some of which are interesting. You know, but the point is, this is not what we would call supper meal. This is the kind of invitation to a visiting speaker, to a luncheon, to question him about what he's been doing and talking about. And as such, it's open to the public. There are the invited guests, and we know the invited guests to this meal are Simon, Jesus, and other of Simon's friends and fellow Pharisees. We know that. It tells us that. Verse 49, "Then those who were at table with him began to say amongst themselves, 'Who is this who even forgives sins?'" This is the crux of this dinner meeting. On what basis can this itinerant teacher forgive the sins of this prostitute? Blasphemy. We're going to test his credentials. Let's invite him to supper and sit down and question him. And the question is put to us in a bit of an aside in verse 39. If this man were a prophet, it says he invited him, and when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself. You know, you can envision this. It's not something he would say openly. But you know that as they retell this story in the small house churches of the Christians who would meet together, they would say, you know what his motivation was? He was trying to test Jesus, to probe this claim that he could forgive sins. And they sat at table. And again, we're familiar with the custom of the time because we read about it at the Last Supper. That it was a low-lying table in a common room where the meal was placed on a table so that as they reclined with their head at the table and their feet reaching back, facing the wall, that part of their body would be accessible. And it was at that point when they come in, and we know that the procedure was when they came in, there was a seat assigned to you. This is the way they did it. Don't worry about it, it's my wife's phone. There was a seat assigned to you, and it was very important to the Pharisees that they know where they were sitting because it was the chiefest of seats that they liked. I wonder which seat Jesus was assigned to. The only thing I can probably say, it was the hottest seat in the room. One would wonder how this woman, who, when she learned that Jesus was going to be at the house of Simon the Pharisee, how it was that she had access to this house. That was the nature of these open forums, as it were, these community discussions on issues of this nature. A visiting teacher questioned by the local experts, and the community was invited or allowed to enter the room, not to eat. They were not part of the discussion, but it was part of their education. They were allowed to listen to the discussion of the learned people. And so it was, she had access to that room. And she was there from the very beginning. She entered the room almost simultaneously as the guests and took her place in a rather obscure place. Because the role of women in this society is quite different than we think of it now today. They were not to be heard. And she never speaks in this entire story. She never speaks. That would be the custom of the day. And yet her actions shout at you. Her voice may not be heard audibly, but her actions speak volumes. Because she observes the slight that Jesus receives at the hand of Simon, who, as all his guests come in, some are extended the courtesy that every guest should be extended, the washing of the feet, the drying of the feet by the designated servants, the greeting by the host, that it is extended to every guest in that room with the exception of one. And that was Jesus. And having experienced what she experienced earlier in the day, the forgiveness of her sins, she was absolutely crushed. For this indignity to the one who had forgiven her sins. And so she uses every means that she has available to her to overcome this slight. She has no water. She has no power to ask a slave or a servant in the room to bring water. What does she have that she can do to overcome this slight? She has her tears. And she uses what she has available to her to perform the common act of courtesy that was denied by the master of the house. And so she, with her tears, cleanses the feet of the master. And she has no towel with which to dry her feet, dry his feet. And she doesn't have the authority to go to anyone to ask for a towel. And so she uses everything that she has available to her in her power. She has her hair to act as a towel. And for a woman in that society to uncover her head and to let down her hair was considered a shameful act. It was not done. And yet she did it. This is costly love that she has for her master. And she takes her hair and she wipes his feet. And you can hear the quiet in the room. And you can almost see the face of Simon, the host who did not perform the simplest of tasks. turning ghostly white. The indignity, the fact that this woman had the audacity to do what he refused to do, to uncover her head, to let down her hair, and to publicly shame herself, to honor her master. And you can hear the quietness of Simon's friends around them. And one would wonder what they're going through each one of their minds. Heaping coals of fire on their heads in a very quiet, nonverbal, all-action way. You would wonder what Jesus is thinking at this point. You know, to have your feet washed has implications, and we know what the implications are in this society. To have your feet washed by a woman who is of this reputation and who is shaming herself publicly by unveiling herself, you would think would bring shame on the person who is receiving the action. Certainly when you think of the Last Supper, the fact that Jesus was washing the feet of his disciples has implications. All you have to do is think back about John the Baptist and his comment about Jesus, a man whose shoelaces I'm not even capable or permitted to tie. Working with somebody's feet, and yet Jesus is accepting this. You marvel at the graciousness of Jesus. He's not the least bit embarrassed by this at all. He has forgiven her sins. You know, but it's one thing to forgive her sins, and it's another thing for the community around you to see that he has forgiven her sins. That's an aspect of this story that many times we don't appreciate and realize. That these things that Jesus does, these forgiveness of sins, is not just an individual thing, one-on-one. I understand that that's where we come from in 21st century Protestant Christianity, wherever we're coming from. When we look at this, we look at things as a one-on-one issue, that salvation is a matter of individual faith. But there is a community. And that community cannot be ignored. You are part of a community. And if you are restored to that community, the community needs to acknowledge that you've been accepted. And that's what Jesus is doing here. That's why he's permitting this to go on. He is not as much concerned about Simon here as he is about this woman being accepted back into her community because her sins have been forgiven. You know, it's the same issue with Zacchaeus. You all know the story of Zacchaeus up in the tree. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. You know, he's lumped in with these prostitutes and sinners. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And the issue in the story of Zacchaeus, Jesus went to his house, but the key words, and I want you to look at them, the story of Zacchaeus, it's in Luke, I think Luke 19. It's a concept that I think is important to see in the actions that Jesus takes. Luke chapter 19. You know, there are so many things in this story of Zacchaeus which tell you about the position that Zacchaeus held in the community and how he humbled himself to bring Jesus to his house and how honored he was that Jesus was there. Starting in verse 7 of Luke 19. When they saw it, they there is the community. They are the people who lived and knew Zacchaeus. They all murmured, something's not right about this. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. You know, the discussion in John's Gospel, particularly chapter 8, keys you in into what that phrase means. He is a son of Abraham. And the importance that that played to the people of that time. That was the the tag, if you would, of acceptability in the community. He is a son of Abraham. He had not been, but now he is. Jesus went to Zacchaeus' house to confirm that point to the community in which Zacchaeus lived, that he was a part of the community, and he was not to be held as an outsider. And that's why he allowed the woman, back in Luke chapter 7, to wash his feet. It was to demonstrate to all those in the room that she was forgiven, and they were to take her back. Back to Luke chapter 7. And it's in this context that we come to the parable. And parables are used by many ways in Jesus. Sometimes the parable takes up a good part of the narrative, and a very small section of it sets the context. This is entirely different. There is a huge context here that you have to appreciate in order to understand the parable. The parable is the parable of the two debtors. It starts in verse 41. Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered and he said, what is it, teacher? You know, I can envision a little bit of tenseness in this conversation, considering what has just happened. And this phrase, Simon, I have something to say to you, is not one of these raising your hand and asking permission. This is a phrase where it says, something is wrong and it needs to be set right. It's the phrase that a parent uses with a child. When the child has displayed something that displeases the parent, and the parent says to him, we need to talk. That's the seriousness of this statement. Now, there's a lot of guest-host interaction here. And we all know the etiquette when you're in somebody's house. It's considered bad form, isn't it? To contradict the host or to rebuke the host in front of his guests. Even in our society, in this society even more so. So when Jesus says to Simon, I have something to say to you, everybody again is holding their breath. This is the rebuke. What is it, teacher? A certain creditor had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he forgave them both. Now, which of them will love him more? You know, parables are not meant to obscure and hide the truth from the eyes of those who are hearing them. This is a parable that hit right between the eyes. There was no pulling of punches. Simon understood exactly who was who. He understood that the prostitute who had washed and dried the feet of Jesus and had anointed him was the debtor of 500. And he recognized in his own eyes that he was the debtor of 50. And yet they're both forgiven. Who has the more love? Well, I presume the one that's been forgiven more. And that's what drove the woman there that day, isn't it? Now, as you go through this parable, again, one of the misreadings of this parable is, why was she forgiven? Because she had a lot of love. That's not what the parable says. She had a lot of forgiveness. And the love was there. The gratitude for the mercy and the kindness that was shown to her. Verse 44. Turning to the woman, he said, do you see this woman? And again, Jesus has still not addressed the woman directly. You know, in this particular case, the words mean it's one of these. He's talking to Simon and looking at the woman. Simon, do you see this woman? You gave me no water for my feet. She has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil. She has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. He who is forgiven little loves little. You know, the challenge is put out to Simon here to measure up to this woman. And he couldn't do it. He could not do it. Then those who were at table said to amongst themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And one would wonder what the outcome was with Simon. We don't know. It's a remarkable scene, isn't it? When you see it in the power and in the days and the culture in which it actually happened. The power that forgiveness had on that woman, the love that she displayed, is a remarkable thing. She never spoke. She never said a word. And yet her faith speaks volumes. As we turn our thoughts to the breaking of bread, I would like to suggest to you one other passage. Luke chapter 12. And I think there's a connection here. Verse 35 of Luke chapter 12. Take this passage personally. Let your loins be girded and your lamps burning. Be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the marriage feast, so that they may open to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will gird himself and have them sit at table, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or the third and finds them so, blessed are those servants. This parable speaks to us because we find ourselves in that second or third watch, waiting for the master to come. And again, the parable speaks volumes when you look at the details in it. And it says, let your loins be girded. You have to understand the way that they dressed. That in that climate, at that time, even down to this time, they wore long flowing robes in many layers because it was cooler. To gird yourself was to lift up those robes and to tie them around your waist so that you would be ready to work. Think of the passage at the time of Passover when the Israelites were told to eat that first Passover with their loins girded. That means ready to go. The exhortation in this parable is, be ready to go. Let your lamps be burning. And our minds immediately go to the sister parable to this, the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25 and the implications of that. Be like men who are waiting for their master. The comment that was made last night about that word, be like men who are waiting, or as other versions say, looking. And the import behind that is expecting. You know, as we discuss this parable in my home ecclesia, one person used the analogy. We've all been in airports, we've all flown. And there's quite a difference when you're at an airport terminal waiting to receive someone and sitting there waiting for a flight to go out. There are two different kinds of waiting. The waiting that is here is the waiting of someone is coming. Someone is coming. And it's an expected waiting. It's an expectation of waiting. For their master to come home from the marriage feast. And that phrase, come home, again, doesn't mean necessarily that the festivity is over. What it means is he's leaving in midstream. The feast is ongoing, and he is leaving before it's done. Quite an exceptional thing for someone to do, isn't it? The master leaving before the festivities are done. And he's coming from the marriage feast so that they may open to him at once when he comes and knocks. Many passages in the New Testament demonstrate the point. They answered the door differently than we do sometimes. You know, we have this sense that the door, when we come up, push the doorbell, knock on the door. We don't say anything. The custom in those times was, you may knock, but you always called out. Look at the story of Peter when he was released from prison and Rhoda went and answered the door. I recognized his voice. He knocked. I recognized his voice. You know, Revelation 3, verse 20, a very verse that we're all familiar with. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. He who hears my voice. And that's the case here as well in this parable. When the master leaves the marriage feast, halfway done, and returns that they may open to him, the reason they open to him is not because he returns and knocks, it's because they recognize who is there. They recognize his voice. If he comes in this, verse 37. Blessed are those servants when the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you. That phrase, truly I say to you, the import of that phrase is, wait a minute. Wait a minute, it's coming. It's going to be a surprise. He will gird himself and have them sit down at table, and he will come and serve them. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. They're not going to serve him. He's going to serve them. Whoa! Talk about a twist. If he comes in the second or third watch and finds them so, blessed are those servants. You know, and as we're here, this parable was acted out by Jesus at the Last Supper, wasn't it? When he girded himself with a towel and he washed the feet of his disciple. And you can see the confluence of these two parables. The parable of the prostitute in the house of Simon the Pharisee. And how Jesus used this parable to talk about the need of his purpose was not to be served, but to serve. And so he washed the feet of his disciples. These are the parables that were used in the first century, which turned the world on its head. And they were told to each other, to encourage one another, as they came together to remember the Lord Jesus, so that if he tarries into the second or the third watch, these are the things that we're to think on. That when he comes, he will sit down with us anew and drink that cup and eat that bread in his kingdom with us.